Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, but I think most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia, and perhaps most excitingly and specifically, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance behind the landmark findings on how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes mitigating injuries through to pathways to secure that top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, the V by Dr. B, to the rule of transference. I've coined terms from the barrier breaker to the golden rule and a slew of others. As has become custom in each episode, we've been diving into one of my books to share additional insights so you can really just delve deeper and really pull apart what's between the pages, so to speak, and integrate that into your game, specifically if you want to follow the pathway, the long game towards that top 10 tennis ranking. The book we've been focusing on is The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. And if you have been listening for some time now, you know I get a bit excited about key parts here, and today's no different. But you know what, if today's your first episode you're tuning into, bear with us, and I'm sure that you're going to have something to walk away with and really apply and integrate into your own game. So as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm actually quite excited about today's chapter. I think most specifically and profoundly because I know its correlations with developing that top 10 tennis ranking, even if we are starting early on. So a lot of the work really involves looking at the top 10, but then regressing, so to speak, or dialing that time back to when that player was 10 or 15, and we know the correlations that are in place and what it takes to obviously become a top 10 tennis player, but I think more profoundly what it takes to stay inside the top 10, and more excitingly and I know I'm going to date this episode by saying this, Wimbledon has just wrapped up and we have two new Wimbledon champions. Both of them won their first Wimbledon titles, which is incredibly exciting for Vondrousova and Alcaraz. And when we're looking, I think, at the grand scheme of things, we know the work that's involved prior. One of them, obviously, Vondrousova, has made her top 10 debut. Alcaraz has been in the top 10 now for, I want to say, roughly almost the 2-year period, not quite, but there are specific progressions in place to get to that level of play. So I think what I'm sharing is that when you have, I guess, those keys, and we talk about the 7 keys here, and you're able to integrate them when you're around that 10, 11, 12 years of age, or that 15, 16 years of age, we also know when you are going to peak or reach, I think, that first 10-year milestone where you're looking towards your first initial peak performance up. And when we say that, it could be ascending from 200 in the world to 30 in the world. It could be as profound as 200 in the world again, but progressing almost towards the top 10, because your rate of progress that we've touched on and that speed of progress is actually amplified because all of a sudden those 7 keys are being integrated in unison. And that's why you wonder why some players progress a lot quicker than others. And it really comes down to what their baseline was, the work that was done to build their foundation, and their level of awareness of the 7 keys. And then that's tied into obviously their rate of progress. A lot of times, and we've touched on this before, most specifically or recently in our last episode, and what we touch on, I guess, more profoundly is that if you do not have access to those keys, more often than not, you're going to be stuck at, 80, 60, 50 in the world. And again, you can look at the rankings on both the ATP and WTA tours, and look, 80% of players fluctuate within those ranking ranges, in contrast to making their run, making that ascension towards the top 10. And we know why. And that's okay if you're comfortable staying there, because at the end of the day, that is an absolute elite level of play. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of others who have not made that. There are hundreds of thousands of players just fighting for that initial ranking point on the ITF and other respective, circuits now. And what it comes down to is really harnessing that knowledge from an early stage, and then being mindful of that 10-year pathway. Because look, at the end of the day, if you are that 17-year-old, you need to be mindful of putting that work in to peak around that 27, okay? But we have players that peak a lot sooner. And so, I'm sure a lot of you are asking, why? Why do some take 10? Why do some take 5? And it's not necessarily that 5, they've been putting the work in. It's not like they started playing at 8 years of age and then at 13 they obviously, were inside the top 10. We know that's not the case. But if you're putting that work in and you're privy to, that depth to breadth of knowledge, when it really comes down to those foundations and solidifying that baseline, you are better prepared to ascend sooner than your peers. And that's obviously tied to, we've touched on rate of progress. But it's most specifically about, I think, that triangular approach that we've talked about with the player athlete and the parent and the coach, and the dynamic that's, interplayed there to progress the athlete towards, their end goal. But most, succinctly, it's also having that knowledge or a level of awareness on what's required. But it's not about just the player, it's about the coach. And how that relationship works to optimize performance, which obviously talks back to the title of the book. Now look, today's topic is on why isn't your player or athlete listening to you? It's not them, it's you. And if you want to follow along, we are on page 136. But look, before I dive in, it's so important to share and to touch on the whys there. So why do some athletes excel and others not so much? And they could both be putting in, the same work, the same training loads, and also they could have the same coach. So let's roll with this, the same coach. Obviously, the differential here is, what is the rapport like between, say, player A and player B, and obviously that coaching dynamic with the respective players. Now, what you will see is, again, obviously, as the chapter's title, is that it's actually not about the player or athlete in question, because they are putting in the work. And this is specifically for the coaches out there, it's how in tune are you to coaching, player A and player B? Are you as in tune with both of them? Do you understand how they receive and perceive information the best? Do you acknowledge and, modify your coaching pedagogy in respect to what suits the player best? Or are you just using that one coaching style, just hoping it works for one of them? Now, more often than not, it's the last one. You're hoping it works for one of them. And obviously the player that is performing best, it's that one. And unfortunately, that player who is not performing the best, it's not them, it's you. And this is, I think, really important for the parents out there to be able to have those conversations with their child, to be mindful of this, because a lot of athletes, specifically in that developmental, age range, whether, you're 8 through to 16 years of age, obviously these levels fluctuate. And it's so fundamental to be mindful of that. It's not that players or athletes' fault. It's about having that level of rapport. And if you are that adolescent, more often than not, you do not understand this. You are not mindful of this because, look, at the end of the day, you're a teenager. And you expect, and for the coaches out there, they expect of you to be their guide. And a lot of the time, coaches are not aware of this or conscious of this. So if you are listening and you are a coach, please be more mindful of this with your athletes and players. For the parents, this is where you come in to be able to have those conversations with your child about what works best for them. Do they have a coach that understands how they learn? Do they have a coach that understands, how they listen, like what they're really picking up, that understands just really how they learn, their learning style? And I'm saying this because we know, and obviously if you have read one of my latest publications, The 7 Keys to Optimize Your Life, it uses tennis to develop behaviors that delivers optimal performances in play and in life. That actually is the full title. And even though it's quite loaded there, it really unwraps the distinct learning curve there between individuals. And we know that if you are in that conducive coach-athlete relationship, that obviously is supported by that triangular relationship between the coach-parent relationship. And we've touched on this in previous episodes. Now, we know if you are mindful of this and conscious of this, and you are integrating this into those training loads, the development of the player as a whole, that the likelihood of you continuously and continuing to progress towards becoming a professional player, and then advancing through the rankings from whether it's 900 in the world through to 400 in the world through 150 in the world, and finally breaking into the top 100 and so on. We know that actually happens, and only exclusively happens when that is tapped into. If that is not tapped into, we know it doesn't happen. And that's why, unfortunately, and also due to funding issues for players, largely ranked outside, that top 150, 200 in the world, that is the reality. And it's so important to just have that right coach as that guide that understands, how you are receptive. And that is also a very good, indicator why we do see some very successful, but also unsuccessful, very successful athlete-parent coaching relationships there, where the parent coaches their child, but they know and understand how their child learns best. Though, again, this is not across the board, because there are many, obviously, not so successful parent-child coaching dynamics out there, because maybe they don't know. Or they know, but they don't know how to apply. And that's really important, because especially to the parents out there, it's saying it's not that you're doing anything wrong, because first and foremost, you are a parent before the coach. But obviously that's where the the coach comes in because we can draw the line there. And that's not the case. And more often than not, obviously, we do see that coach-athlete relationship being the most successful. Because if we're looking at the grand scheme of things, how many parents coach their child to win Grand Slams or to get inside the top 10? We know that is more often than not, less than 10%. And oftentimes it can be higher, but when we look at, the top 100, we can narrow that down. But irrespective, we know that is not like a 90% ratio whatsoever. You do see very successful relationships from that, that parent-child standpoint, though, because of this. And the coaches who are able to replicate this, the coaches who are mindful of this, have just as powerful and even more so profound outcomes. And some of those examples obviously is Roger Federer and the profound relationship he had with his coach and the coaching team over the years. Another core one would obviously be Rafael Nadal, obviously with his uncle. And it was not his parent, but it was, let's say, a very familiar relationship. So we can look at it as a very successful, almost parent dynamic there and how it worked for him. We can look at Serena Williams, and she did obviously have her parents, and then that changed. But irrespective, what changed in that, I think, that coaching dynamic, but what remained was the fluidity in respect to that level of understanding, which is fundamental. And we can look at Novak Djokovic, who has had that incredibly successful relationship with his coaches over the years, not the parents, it's actually been the coaches. So similar to Roger Federer in that respect. Obviously similar to Rafael Nadal if we are looking at that, a non-familiar relationship there. However, I'm using these four primarily because we know these four are, in their own respects, the best tennis players of our era. With, whether it was the first to get to 20 Grand Slams, the first to get to 23 Grand Slams, the first to get to 21, and then obviously within the past season, we've had Djokovic tie with Serena in that respect. But what we're really looking at is that, and I've touched on in just recent episodes, is that we're not distinguishing. There is no difference between the WTA and ATP tours, because we have Serena reaching that 23 Grand Slam milestone, and now obviously Djokovic as well. And so gender does not play a role in this respect or whatsoever, because you can reach the elite echelon of play irrespective if you are a male or a female. But what counts is that coaching dynamic and how that coach corresponds with you as that athlete or player. So here I'm obviously talking specifically to the players out there, to the athletes out there, and making sure that dynamic is again conducive. And you obviously have heard that a lot now. And it's been repeated because it is absolutely fundamental and it is oftentimes overlooked. We know from a scientific standpoint, it is one of the core differentiators between a player who maintains their level of play for the long game, for that 10-year pathway, and continues to progress. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want to progress, because with that, our ranking progresses, opposed to reaching that plateau. There are a lot of players, for example, who only will reach the second round of a Grand Slam, or only reach the third round of a Grand Slam, but they get stuck. There's like a block. They cannot progress further. And this happens not just once or twice. It can happen over the course of, 5, 6, 7 years. And there are specific performance metrics that are correlated with that we know, and that it's quite a significant hurdle to overcome. But once you've obviously overcome that hurdle and you can look at progressing again, that's where it starts. And it's quite exciting when we look at, once we know the 7 keys and we're able to really integrate them into our level of play, we know that it's not only synonymous with a top 10 tennis ranking, we also know, I think most excitingly, and obviously this is where the golden rule comes in, and the barrier breaker, etc., is that we know what leads to that initial that maiden Grand Slam championship title, that win, and replicated success. So we know what it takes specifically to win more than one Grand Slam championship title. We also know why and how a player can stay inside the top 10 for more than a season, so more than that 1 year. Because believe it or not, you look at the rankings at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, those top 10 players will not be the same at the end of the year. Because you have those barrier breakers on both sides of the tour. You have other players looking to ascend towards the top 10. And granted, there's a huge minority, not majority, minority, where that obviously happens too. It happens. And that's why it's so important. So we know how, we know why. There are a select number of players every year that are capable of maintaining their hold on the top 10 tennis rankings. And this, believe it or not, we come full circle here to how we optimize our performance, to building those foundations, and how it comes back to, why isn't your player or athlete listening to you? It's not them, it's you. And I know this has been quite long in detail, but it's so important to understand how the listening, I think, or the skill, and how it's embedded into a coach's pedagogy, how it's embedded into that coach-athlete dynamic. It is throughout that coaching spectrum. It's throughout that performance spectrum. It's a key ingredient to optimize a player's performance, specifically if they're looking at progressing. And we can say progressing from, that junior to club level to academia level. We can look at the academia level to having their own personal or private coach. We can look at, progressing rankings wise. We can look at it performance wise with titles to, tournaments won, etc. And it is an absolute key ingredient. And unfortunately, a lot of players that do not progress, this is something that is not integrated into that coaching dynamic. All right, so if you want to follow along, again, we're on page 136. As a coach, you are bound to come across a player or athlete that just doesn't respond like those you have previously worked with. A lot of coaches find themselves quite literally banging their head against a brick wall in some instances, but there is a way around it. Now, this obviously refers to, the analogy given earlier about that player A and player B with the same coach, and how one, obviously their performance progresses and the others is just not hitting the mark, but it's the same coach. Now, as a former player, this happened to me a lot. I had the same coach as the best players at the academy. The exact same. I was putting in the work, a ridiculous amount of work. So I do get it from that playing standpoint. And I didn't understand until later, when I became that elite performance coach, what was missing. And then I was able to go, oh, that's why. Because I did not understand what the coach was saying and or They did not understand me. They did not want to engage me, which is really disheartening. And I think especially as an adult now, to be able to look back and see where it fell apart. But also I think in a more a positive light, how it worked for those other players and the coaching dynamic there and what it took and takes. And so specifically here, I'm talking to the coaches, is that I understand from that playing perspective, that coaching perspective, but I think more so as well that scientific standpoint when we look at the data as well. So it's not just subjective in that respect, that we know why player B is not at the level of player A, and the capacity is there, the potential is there. And if you follow the roadmap, so to speak, so the pathway, they will get there. So again, for the parents then, it's so fundamental and important to find that right dynamic that works for the child, so the coach and the player can work together to optimize their performance without hopefully that child experiencing, hey, what I did back then of not feeling heard, not feeling understood, and then not having a coach that listened. And that is absolutely, it's pivotal, because you have a child, if they're not being heard, and we know, and again, whether you want, the data intertwined there, it's there, about the coaches need to be able, they need to be conscious of that level of understanding and to listen as well, and to shape each practice accordingly. And more often than not, coaches aren't putting in the work to shape each, lesson or session for that individual, because we get caught up in that group structure. Now, nothing's obviously wrong with that group structure, but you still need that individualization. So if that individualization is not there, that's where it tends to fall apart. Standing back from a distance, I have seen many coaches give the same talk, the same lecture, the same advice, whilst using the same method of delivery, irrespective of who they are coaching. However, in order to develop and grow as a coach, and in return be an asset to your player or athlete, you need to accommodate their learning needs. And I think this is absolutely, it's key, because I love when we can look at a coach as an asset, because at the end of the day, you are, and or you can be, and or you should be. The coach is, I think, the guide. You are relied upon to get that player to a certain level, to a certain endpoint, to a certain set objective. And if we're narrowing it down here to a top 10 tennis ranking, are you putting in the work? Are you valuable enough for the player, that athlete, to hold on to you for the long game, for that 10 years, for that 15, 20 years of play? Now, unfortunately, there's a very small majority of coaches that are in it for that length of time, or have that capacity to be in it for that length of time. Now, that's okay if you can't, but be upfront about it. Be, I think, more conscious as a coach what your asset is, what you're there to deliver. And when you say what you're there to deliver, make sure you have the skills to deliver upon that. For the parents out there and the players, your number one question should be, no pressure here for the coaches, is if they are aware of, privy to the knowledge around and intertwined in and with the 7 keys. Because if you have a coach who is not conscious of them, and your end goal is to ascend towards the top 10, we know the odds are not in your favor. I'm sorry to share that with you, but in a good way, it's saying that we know, so find the coach that does. And if you are that coach listening, hey, upskill. The 7 keys are there for you to learn and integrate into your coaching pedagogy. And obviously that's a term I think I've repeated, but we've touched on that in previous episodes. So I think most simply, let's look at your framework. What shapes you as a coach? What are your foundations to your core beliefs that allows you to be an asset for your player, that allows you to progress them towards the top 10? And more often than not, a mistake is made that if a coach was a phenomenal player, they could have been ranked inside the top 10, and they may have even won a Grand Slam or 2 or even more. But there's a reason why not every player that has won a Grand Slam or has been inside the top 10 aligns with and is a wonderful coach. There is a very small minority of coaches who have that capacity, and that's simply because, one, they do not have access or are not aware of the 7 keys. And we also have to be mindful of it's a new era of play. This last decade has progressed potentially more faster or as fast as others. It could be argued, because I think we've just witnessed the most successful 10 to 20 years of play with 4 players on the respective tours amassing 20 or more Grand Slam championship titles, which is something that has never happened in the sport of tennis before. Sure, we've had players who have exceeded that by 1, and we've had others who have obviously won multiple Grand Slams over the years. We can even look at the Navratilova and Everett era, for example. We can look at Steffi Graf to her accomplishments, to Margaret Court. But when we're looking at that level of play on both tours and how it has been dominated in this respect, it's a first. Even if we're looking at Sampras to Agassi, they never got to that level, nor was it, I think, synonymous on both tours. You obviously had Graf progressing even further with 20 plus Grand Slams, whilst, Sampras sat on, I think it was, from memory, I want to say 13, 14. And to have 4 players on the WTA and ATP tours just collectively amass that amount, we know how fast the game has changed to not only allow that to happen. We've had players trying to keep pace, but they've struggled to, and we know why they've struggled to. And one of, I think, the most exciting thing that these top 4 share, and this is obviously in more detail in all of my books. One thing all of them share, believe it or not, is the listening. It is that coach-athlete dynamic. All 4 of them have longevity on their side in that respect, and or when changes have been made, that change has also been, I'll say, long-term. It's not something that's for 2 months, 6 months. The work has been done to make sure that new coach is, let's say, on that same wavelength. We can look at Nadal, for example, transitioning from his uncle to Carlos Moya, and how effective that has been, how it really worked for him. We can look at the beginning of Federer's career, transitioning from his initial coach that he lost, unfortunately, on to the next, and how wonderful it worked out for him. Sure, he has had other coaches along for the ride that were a part of his team, and they did not stay just for a matter of months. They were there long term. And I think Andy Murray is a very good example of that too, more recently. But also you can look at Djokovic. He had a very long-term coach there that worked really well for him. And then when Goran Ivanisevic joined the team, we know that's obviously in long term is still there, but it worked. So the work was put in to make sure it was mutually conducive, that the athlete was heard. We can look at Serena, and I will try to pronounce it right. I'm just going to say Patrick here. And that relationship there, how it was reciprocal. It afforded a certain level of play, which obviously is exceptional. But the dynamic is fundamental, because for all four of these players, they have these traits where they have had long-term coaches but also transitioned, and they've also had coaches come on board to help for periods of time, but also long-term as a part of the team. And that's what it's all about. More often than not, you have players chopping and changing. You get the picture. And you have to ask yourself the question then, are they being listened to? And more often than not, the answer is no. If you're a coach out there and you want to establish that long-term commitment with that athlete player, you need to listen to them, please. Obviously, the players, the athletes out there, it's reciprocal. But also finding that coach that understands you, that listens to you, but you are comfortable with that reciprocal level of understanding is fundamental, because here I'm really giving, I guess, those key indicators of what's behind a successful coaching dynamic. And I think before I get carried away and give any more hints, because these are really good ones, and I say really good ones is because everything I think I've just shared, when we're looking at listening in this respect, we know that it is synonymous with a top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for listening today. I know we cut that off a bit short and a little bit more abruptly, but that was for good reason, because hopefully maybe you will rewind that part because it is so fundamental. That section that really delves into listening and the building blocks of an absolutely optimal coaching pedagogy, it's all there. To get your hands on the secrets to optimal performance success, please head on over to AM8 International. That is am8international.com. And if you really want to pick apart even more of, let's say those top 4 and dive into the golden rule, one of those key texts is called What is Your Game Missing to Win? And I will leave all the links in the episode notes in the bio, because it's absolutely fundamental. And I know I don't normally do this, but it's so rich and wrapped in what you really need to learn. And that's probably why I've amassed 11 books, and 10 of those are absolutely fundamental when you're looking at the pathway, because it's about progressing. It's not about reading one and having all the answers, because we know it takes time in a good way. And if you're able to learn and become familiar with these terms and with these principles and integrate them into your game in this respect, that's the more successful you're going to be when we're looking at your performance outcomes. So there is a method to the madness, so to speak. Look, if you want to get in touch, leave feedback, head on over to AM8 International as well too, or Topic Thread. That's the only social network that I'm on. Again, I will leave all the links in the bio. For something fun, a little bit different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. this. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, follow, like, even give us 5 stars if you love us that much. That would be absolutely phenomenal. If you'd like to get in touch with us on the social networks, we are on there now. So, that's whether it's Threads, TikTok, LinkedIn, Medium, Instagram, Twitter, come and say hi. And I will personally try to just reach out and just acknowledge each and every wave, so to speak. So thank you in advance for doing so. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I'm so grateful. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.